Here's a fun, quick little bit of rhythmic tomfoolery from a less well-known band. At the start of Intensive Square's Rhino fight, we get a pretty classic change of feel, where there's this one guitar riff that initially sounds like this, and then the drums change so that it sounds like this. I'm going to do a little bit of theory and then a little bit of analysis. The difference being roughly that theory relates things to bigger ideas and patterns, while analysis looks at what's specific about a single example. So first, for some theory. As far as I'm concerned, this is a classic pulse-preserving tempo modulation riff recontextualization. But please let me explain. As part of my dissertation work, I'm making a big taxonomy of tactus transformations. That is, moments when the felt beat changes in some way. This is an example of what I call a pivot value tempo modulation, because we reinterpret a value already present in the music to kind of pivot from one tempo to another. More specifically, I call this sort of thing a pulse-preserving tempo modulation, because it's the fast pulse, or the subdivision layer, or the 8th note or 16th note, depending on how you're notating this, that doesn't change. We start with 3 of these pulses per beat in the first section, and then switch to 4 pulses per beat in the second section without changing the length of these pulses or the rate of these pulses. This is also what I call a riff-preserving tactus transformation, because the guitar riff is the same at both tempos, and because the guitar riff is actually completely identical, the same sequence of 28th notes at the same tempo. I call it more specifically a riff recontextualization, because it is just the tempo, rhythmic, metric context of the riff that changes, not the riff itself. In other words, I could copy and paste the audio file from the first few times you play this riff onto the second few times, and it would sound exactly the same. These types of moments are really interesting from a theory perspective for a lot of reasons. Probably the nerdiest is that they kind of mess with standard notation. It's not like you can't notate this, but there are a bunch of different ways that you could do so, and all of them are kind of equally logical, and all of them obscure something important. Maybe the most straightforward would be to notate based on the unchanging guitar riff. That would look like this. This is consistent, but it doesn't tell you much about the cymbal hits that have such a huge influence on feel, especially in the first part. Another logical way would be to emphasize these cymbal hits and the backbeats that come with them, but then the unchanging guitar pattern gets obscured. And then both of those options kind of neglect the whole idea of this passage, which is the apparent tempo change. A third option kind of goes against conventions of how stuff normally gets notated, but highlights this striking change of tempo. So that was some theory about the types of things that are happening in this riff. The one analytical detail I want to bring up about this specific riff is that there's a really cool like straightening out feel at the tempo change that has to do with the specific construction of the riff. The riff lasts for 28th notes. When we have 3 eighth notes per beat in the first section, this means that the riff moves against the beat because 20 doesn't divide evenly by 3. So the first time the riff starts on the beat, the second time it starts on the second eighth note of the beat, and the third time it starts on the third eighth note of the beat. This leads to another example of that cool compound meter offbeat thing that I made a big deal about in my video about Tesseract, where stuff feels really wonky when it lags behind the beat by an eighth note in a compound meter, so in a meter where there are 3 subdivisions per beat. Here's that slow. Then when the tactus changes to lasting for 4 subdivisions instead of 3, the phasing effect disappears because 20 does divide evenly by 4. It feels like not only the tempo slows down suddenly, but the riff becomes much more straightforward. I think there's a really cool way to move from metric dissonance, so the phasing when the riff won't sit still in relation to this 3 subdivision beat, to relative metric consonance when it does, and it kind of zooms out and it feels like we have this 5/4 version of the riff. It kind of like focuses all of the power of the riff, which feels kind of twisted in the first tempo, and then like it's charging right at you in the second. So yeah, if you're a fan of this channel and you don't know this album, I highly recommend it. And thank you to whoever commented about this a really long time ago, back when I was still reading all the comments and checking everything that people sent me to check out, because I got like 3 comments a week. And thank you everyone who continues to comment all sorts of things. I do appreciate it, even if I don't have time to read everything anymore. Best of luck with that thing that you're working on. See ya.